Hi, I'm Janna, and today we're going to talk about using comics to share UX research results. Now, when you get out and working in industry, you'll see this a lot. You'll spend just a ton of effort and energy doing some UX research. You'll get really excited about the things that you're finding, and you write this great report. You upload it to your local SharePoint, send around a link, and you leave work that day and you just can't wait for what you hear from people about all these great things that you learned. The next day you log in, you look at some of the analytics, and you find out that only a couple people looked at it, and they looked at it for maybe 30 seconds. And when you start asking these people, they don't remember any of the contents, any of these really exciting findings. And unfortunately, this happens a lot. Uh, and that's a real problem because, why do all this research if it doesn't make an impact? So what's a UXer to do? I've seen lots of different strategies that uh, UX researchers have tried to deal with this problem. So let's just walk through a few. One is science fairs. So you put out all these great snacks and you invite people in to look at all these posters of your research findings. And I've done it and it's delicious, but unfortunately I don't think people actually took a lot out of the experience. Another is memes. What a great way to get people to read through the whole report if there's a bunch of jokes sprinkled in. Unfortunately, while this might mean that people spend a little bit more time in your reports, it actually doesn't do anything to guarantee that they retain the information. Now there's stakeholder photos. Everybody's favorite topic is themselves. So yeah, why not sprinkle their names and pictures throughout the report to try to get them to read it. Unfortunately, there's that same retention issue that there is with memes. Finally, there's that highlight reel movie night type atmosphere that you can do. You get the whole team together, you pop some popcorn, and you show highlights of your usability testing. And admittedly, this packs a real emotional punch. Unfortunately, a lot of times the people that you most want to attend these sessions are too busy to do it, and it just doesn't have the same sort of pull when you're looking at it later on. So I'm going to share an approach that worked for me for this, which is comics. Now, let's clarify what type of comics I'm actually talking about, because it's not DC or Marvel. Well, if that's your thing, that's okay. That's not mine. Yeah. It's also, not like XKCD, or the oatmeal. It's not jokes. We're talking about really important experiences. So what is it more like? Well, here's one example. It's like, the work done by Susie Cagle, who's a graphic journalist. This is a shot from, one series that she did on, type 2 diabetes. And she's really using comics as a means to reach a larger audience with a really important message. Another example is it's called an ethnographic comic. And it is, this one's called Lisa. And Lisa is about the Arab Spring movement in Egypt. Again, a very serious topic, but uses comics to sort of help make it more relatable. So how did I get into this? Well, I'll give you a bit of my success story. So it started with working with a really tough group. So they were nice people, but they were statistics experts. And I came into this project and I wanted to do some nice qual interviews to get some sort of deep insight into the topic that I was working on. And I was freaked out. How am I ever going to gain the trust of these deeply analytical people? And I was racking my brain. I was like, okay, these people are never going to read, transcripts, because I thought, if I could at least provide, some transparency, on my process, that'll gain some trust. But they're not going to read transcripts. Then I thought about this book, or this ethnographic novel, Lisa, that I recently read. Now, to be really nerdy, I love Lisa as an ethnographic novel, but half of it is actually they explain the process of putting it together. And something that struck me about, when they're describing the process is that they said that they could take something that was described in a 30-page, academic paper, and they squashed it down into a 2-page spread. I'm like, wow, that's it. Like, I can go and I can, condense all of this information, that I'm learning about users into, just a comic. And then, I'm really sharing, the full details, of what I'm learning. So I turned each one of the interviews that I did into a comic. And this felt very risky, being in a financial organization and pretty conservative culture. And so, no, I can't show you these comics for, obvious confidentiality reasons. Now, it came to presentation day. It felt like a, big risk, as I said. And, the meeting started as I, would expect with, such analytical people. They asked about, how, interviewing 5 people, is, representative, of the larger population. Of course, I knew that, I knew that they were going to ask, these type of questions. So that was no big deal. I was prepared for them. Now, after, we got past those, basic, questions, something amazing happened. They started, barbing back and forth about, the contents of the comics. It's like, oh, can you believe it? When, she did this or that or the other thing. Wow. And that just made my heart so warm as a researcher, because it actually meant that they were retaining, the information that I wanted them to, about my interviews. Like, I just felt like, yes, this is winning. Now, while I said I couldn't show you the comics, I can give you a sense of what they look like, and this is it. These are, it's not like, super, sophisticated, well-drawn, things. Like, this is what I got. And if you're even looking at this and going, I don't know if I can do it, like, to let you in further in the secret, I did it with a tool. So, this is a storyboard, a tool that I love using to, quickly create, comics for things. So you got this. Even if you don't see yourself as, a great artist, I believe that, this can be a tool for you. So I want to explain, how you can do this, with your research too. So let's get started. So step 1 to creating a UX research comic is pretty obvious. You got to actually do UX research. So you got to gather your raw material. So let's talk about, a couple things that, you should be looking in when you're doing your research. One is, what are people doing? The actions that they take. I think this should follow, the rest of the, the courses that you're taking. What are they, thinking and feeling? Comics are just a wonderful medium to, express emotion, in a way that, you can never do in just, a paragraph of text. And finally, pictures. Pictures are so critical because you need them for, when you start constructing a comic, and I'll come back to that later. So when I created, the comic about toothbrushing, the first thing I did, actually, I'll give you a bit of a backstory on this. This comic about toothbrushing was actually part of those like design assignments that you get when applying for a position. They asked me to, make, do some research about, floss. And so I'm actually reusing an old job application design assignment. So I really feel like I'm winning right now. But anyways, to get back to the story about this is, the first thing I had, the people that I was doing research with, to understand about their dental habits is I asked them to tape themselves brushing their teeth, and so I got lots of raw footage about how people actually went about this action. The second thing is I actually at the same time asked them to take pictures of their environment in the bathroom, and so this is where I can get a sense of where they stored various implements that they use for tooth care. Are they like above the sink, or are they hidden away? And after that, I did a one-on-one interview to really learn about their tooth care habits. Now, next thing is, once you've, gathered all of your material, is to create a synopsis. So what the heck is a synopsis? Really it is, just the basic points that as a good reporter, you need to convey in your story. And I think that this is a really critical step because, when you start drawing your comic, it's easy to, take shortcuts or be led to, kind of share the stuff that seems more, dramatic about a story and ignore some of the more mundane things. Whereas if you start with a synopsis, that really keeps you, truthful to what you heard, because it's like essentially your checklist later on to make sure that you covered all the points of, what you learned in your interview. So in my toothbrushing interviews that I did, one of the things I learned about this woman is that they have a permanent retainer that hinders flossing. That's a pretty big deal. Next thing is that they actually said that they only floss teeth when they actually feel something stuck and they got to dislodge it. And another thing, which as a technologist I loved, was they said that they had this sonic toothbrush, which I feel is like just the natural technology inclination for any problem is well, if we just add this amazing app and tells people exactly what they need to do, then of course they're going to be motivated and use it. Well, we had case in point where they had the perfect technology, it was free, and they didn't use it. They never set up the sonic toothbrush. Another thing they said was, their main concern was cavities. They weren't concerned about their teeth falling out, or like some people, they didn't mention, that they're worried about, pockets or gum issues. And something that I think is really great to capture at this point is just some quotes, things that people said that really capture sort of the spirit, of their story. And this person that I talked to was incredibly busy, constantly on the run. And they said, sometimes it's eat or brush my teeth. And so I wrote that down because I thought that that would really give some good color to the story. So, all right, we have the checklist, we have all the research, we have pictures. Now it's time to choose a grid. Now, as a UX person, you're probably screaming inside when I say to start with a grid rather than content. But give me a second, because there's some method to the madness. Is when it comes to comics, a grid is a really important part of the story. Now, grid is really it's sort of how many cells you have on the page and the layout of the cells. And this is actually changes or impacts the storytelling a lot. And so you want to plan your storytelling around how many cells. Now, let me just sort of show you why. So say, we have this really impactful thing about this app, right? And the app doesn't, it's really having no impact. They didn't, start using this toothbrush. If I show the app and then I show the toothbrush on the same page, well, because of the way that, people look at comics, you're going to immediately just jump into the punchline. You'd be like, oh, look, brand new toothbrush. And it doesn't have a lot of impact. Whereas you can, change the impact by, putting the app on one page and then having that kind of cool surprise on the next one, and sort of give some pause and some emphasis to this point that you really want to get across. So it's very important to sort of plan out what your grid is so that you can sort of get the right points across in your story. Now, another thing about the grid is that you have to consider what people are looking on it or looking at your comic on. Now, it's really appealing to create comics that look like your standard comic book. It seems fun, right? But any company I've worked at, people aren't handing around a lot of paper. Really, how people are looking at things is mostly on their desktop monitors, and so I believe it's important to design for that form factor. So really thinking about a landscape type view that again people can see things at the same time as you intend and as you design. Now, all right, great. So you have a grid. What do? You map out the story. Now, there really is no industry standard format to how to mock up or map out your UX, your comics in general, right? So this is just what I've done that works for me. So I might I'll just walk you through a couple features. So I have in each cell some of the dialogue that I expect them to say, as well as my initial thoughts on what I think would work for the visuals. And really, like when I do this, while I'm showing it on a grid here, a lot of times I'm actually writing stuff on sticky notes and I'm moving them around within the grid to really get my storytelling right. To make sure that I'm taking advantage of my page breaks, as well as sometimes just using the cells and like pacing the story well, right? Sometimes you actually want a little bit of a break or a couple different cells devoted to an idea to really emphasize it. Now, to call out a couple things, one thing you'll notice is that my story starts with the person I'm interviewing actually talking head on to the camera to the reader, and there's a bit of a story behind this. So when I first got started, I was really struggling with, how am I going to kind of like set the scene? There seems to be a lot of stuff that I want to tell, readers that, isn't really action, right? Like it's just, I just, there's no obvious action to, illustrate. They're not doing something, they're talking about their feelings, which is, kind of a common, UX thing. And, this kind of went against a lot of, rules that you'll read around, making comics. They're always like, oh yes, put action in every cell. But when I actually saw the work that Susie Cagle did, as a graphic journalist, and I saw that, a lot of her reporting started with, showing an end user on that first panel, talking, it really, it opened my eyes. I was like, yes, that is the right, scene to set at, the beginning of the story. And so since I saw her do it, I felt like that gave me license to, break a comic rule, but really do the right thing for expressing research through comics. Another thing you'll see is that we're really showing emotion. As I mentioned before, I think comics are really great medium for expressing users' emotions, and therefore actually helping helping garner empathy for like sort of what they're doing and their world. And so, here I have, just the notes that, I want, April shrugging, just to show, while you might judge, April for always being on the run and, maybe not being the most fastidious about her, tooth care, she doesn't really care. Like, she seems, just fine with it. Another thing is that I see a lot of times, I'm trying to use people rather than objects, in my storytelling. So, there is like sometimes, I'll eat or rather brush my teeth. So that's the comment here. And I could readily, just show like, a sandwich, like, sitting on the table forlorn, right? Or like, or there's so many like, symbols, that I could put into this cell. But I think as much as possible, it's important to get, the user and their emotions into cells. And so, this time, instead of, putting a symbol of like, like lunch, I actually have, the person, running out the door, trying, and that'll just like help with, feeling empathetic for, her just feeling, very, very busy. All right. Next step is probably the step that you're most looking forward to, which is drawing. And maybe this is the one that you're actually least looking forward to. So you have a couple options for putting together comics. So first one is doing what I've done with this comic about the woman and her toothbrushing habits, which is using a tool. So as I mentioned before, I really like the tool Storyboard that, and it's not the most beautiful tool, as a UX UX people, we always like tools that have beautifully rounded corners and wonderfully thought through interactions. This isn't it. Like there's some really clunky parts of it, but it really grows on you, and it's pretty fun to use. Now, there's a lot of basic elements that are available in the tool. Something to be aware of is you're probably going to want to add some of your own. For my toothbrushing comic, I had to like they don't have a permanent retainer picture, or actually frankly even a toothpaste tube or a toothbrush, and so I had to make all those. And yeah, in the jobs I've had, I've built up libraries of things that I commonly have to talk about as part of my work, right? And so I worked for a hearing aid company, and so I had a bunch of hearing aids ready to put in different comics that I was making. Now, something to be forewarned about with using Storyboard that is that it's easy to kind of go overboard with some of the detail that you add to the comics. Like they have like a whole bunch of backgrounds that you can add to a picture, but like you'll look at this background and who lives in this bedroom? Well, this guy, like, and every little piece of the drawing adds information, and you have to be careful about whether that information is accurate or not. So for me, I don't actually use any of their backgrounds because I don't want to convey information that I didn't have, and that's why I was asking for pictures in the first place, is so that I can be really true to what I learned. Now, your second option, if you're feeling more adventurous, is to make your own drawings. So it's a DIY option. So, I mean, you could do something like oatmeal, or this is at XKCD, and you can see that like this isn't like the most like sophisticated drawing. This isn't the most talented artist in the world. However, like it's really effective and it's endearing despite being stick figures. Now, I'd encourage you to go a step further, and you can try to draw it. So, some steps for drawing your own. One is that you can try. You actually can create like a rough draft of your picture. There's a wonderful type of pencil called non-coffee blue, and so I have one of those at home, and I can just sort of create a draft of what I want in each of the cells, and frankly I can draw and redraw it, and it's non-coffee blue, so it's only going to be in my draft. So what is that pencil? Here's just a quick zoom in of the non-coffee blue pencil. So after you create that uh, sort of draft of it, then you can actually outline it in normal thin tip marker. And again, these aren't super fancy drawings. It's just enough to make it endearing and kind of catch someone's eye. And then you want to photocopy it, or this happens. So you can get a lot of bleeding if you just put marker right over something with these like felt tip markers. Like they're just terrible for bleeding. So you want to photocopy it. And frankly, when I photocopy it, I probably make like 5 copies and kind of play with like how I'm going to color it in. So here's just an example of how that non-copy blue doesn't come through when photocopying. And this was just like photocopying it like the local Staples, so it works really nicely. Next, you can play with making it a little fun by coloring in a couple things, and if you want, you can add a bit of shading. And I mean, you don't need to have like a full expensive set of markers to add some interest with color. Like frankly, if you have a couple grays and single primary color, I think that's enough to sort of make things look a little bit interesting. So then you can scan your photo, and I'd suggest adding all of your text inside your computer, because that's going to be a lot faster for your typography. Now, how do you add type? So you can add some free fonts. There's lots of free fonts that look like handwritten text. So there's this like indie flower, very clear hand. Now you look at both of them, and they have some pretty serious issues with sort of the text spacing. That's kind of what you get when you get things for free. Now you can pay for some fonts that look like handwriting too, and then it actually looks like it was naturally handwritten, because nobody would make those kerning mistakes that you saw with the free fonts. So the one that I really like is like Scott McCloud's font. So Scott McCloud wrote a wonderful book about understanding comics, and so it's kind of fun to use his paid font. It's pretty expensive though. There's another one, KG Drops of Jupiter, and you can find that just on the web. It is actually like a fairly inexpensive font, but another one that looks pretty nice with comics. And a neat thing too is that the same author made the font for the oatmeal. So if you want your UX comics to kind of look like they were made by the guy that makes the oatmeal, kind of neat. So great, you have your comic together. Next step is to review it. So why do you review? Well, I really like the whole purpose of reviewing is to make sure that you were actually a reliable reporter of what you learned through user interviews. I think that there's a lot of temptation in creating comics, because you see so many comics which are jokes. It's temptation to try to emphasize the funny elements of what you heard, or the comedy of it, but that's not what you're trying to do. You're not trying to amuse your audience. You're trying to gain empathy for the people that you interviewed, so that you can serve them better. And so having somebody that sat in the interviews with you and that can criticize every element. Are you accurately depicting their emotions through it? Are you accurately depicting the context that actions are happening? These are all really good questions to be asking before sharing out your comics. And then finally, it's time to share them. And something I like doing is bundling them up and then sharing them out with my stakeholders ahead of time. kind of gets them, excited about the meeting that they're going to come up to. And then, after then, I have a whole sort of a Medium article that I wrote about, how I like to share comics in meetings. And so, while I might have a pre-story that, is sort of that PowerPoint presentation that has that, landscape view, a lot of times in meetings, I like to share them sort of panel by panel. Now, I've been, thinking and learning about comics for quite a while. And I definitely want to tell you about, some of the people that, really have inspired me, with their work. So one is Deb Aoki. So she has all sorts of, work online where she's using, comics for all sorts of things, UX related. So I know everything from storyboarding, future experiences, and journey mapping, and pretty neat stuff. There's Bonnie Colville Hyde, and she's written a whole bunch about storyboarding. And then Mark Neese, and a lot of my thoughts around how to use a grid properly for comics came from his book about writing comics, and he's an instructor at Savannah College of Art and Design. So, and probably not surprisingly, want to give credit, for Storyboard That, because I use that for all the images in this presentation. So thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to your questions.